Hello, so I'm going to give an introduction to the afternoon session now. We covered a huge amount of material over the course of the morning there, and I know some of it was quite difficult. You might be feeling a little bit bamboozled by some of what you've just heard, but don't worry, we've got lots of time to pick up these various threads over the course of this afternoon and tomorrow morning. So I'm going to kind of focus our minds in on the questions that we're asking and then just see where we've got to in relation to those questions through the talks that we heard this morning. So the questions for this weekend are the ones that I mentioned at the start. So first of all, how should standards of ethical behavior be upheld? And particularly within that is political accountability, those mechanisms of political representation and accountability. Are they enough, or do we need something more to uphold ethical standards of behavior? And second, to what extent should government and parliament be subject to legal limits? And again, a couple of questions within that, one focusing in on parliament. So should there be limits on the laws that parliament can pass? And the other one focusing in on government. How do we ensure that government ministers act within their powers? So let's start off then with the first of those questions. How should standards of ethical behavior be upheld? So we've heard that one view in answer to that question is that we should uphold these standards of ethical behavior through politics, through choosing our representatives, holding the representatives to account, questioning in parliament, all these kinds of things. And I guess the argument in favor of this political approach is to say, I mean, there are various arguments, but kind of main argument is, well, voters ultimately are in charge there. So voters have control, and in a democracy, presumably that's quite important. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the view that actually we should have rules that are forcing standards of ethical behavior to be maintained, and that involves regulators and in some cases also courts. And again, there may be various arguments for this, but principal argument is there's a reasonable guarantee that there's going to be an impartial process, that it's not going to be subject to the partisan interests of those in power if you take it out of the political process. You have regulators and courts doing that work. So there are good arguments on both sides of the spectrum here. But the important thing for us to remember is it really is a spectrum. So there really is that range of views across between simply focusing in on politics and simply focusing in on rules-based systems. So there's a range of different approaches that we can take. And just where we put ourselves on that spectrum is going to depend on which of the standards of ethical behavior we might be talking about. So remember, Jane in the morning talked about those various Nolan principles, the different standards that we might expect people in public life to uphold. So just which of those we're focusing on will make a difference to how we answer that question. So say, for example, we're talking about corruption and concern that MPs have been guilty of behaving in a corrupt way. Well, that's a case where we really do have, at the moment, the UK is very much in the middle between relying on politics and relying on regulators and the courts. So if you think of the case of Owen Paterson, that MP recently, he was found to have been basically lobbying MPs on behalf of companies that were paying him. The process there of checking that starts off with the Parliamentary Commissioner, who's an independent person, and she is the person who conducts an investigation and reaches conclusions on what he's been doing. Then her report went to a parliamentary committee, that's half MPs, half people from outside politics, outside Parliament. And they looked at the report, came to their own judgment that yes, indeed, he had been guilty of breaking the rules, and they imposed a penalty. And normally, that's then basically it. So then the final step is that the House of Commons as a whole votes to accept that report. And normally that happens very, very simply. So you have that mixture of the regulator and the politics getting involved. Now, in this particular case of Owen Paterson, the reason it became famous is that essentially the government stepped in and tried to stop the decision to suspend Owen Paterson. So the committee had recommended he should be suspended for 30 days. And the government stepped in and tried to stop that from happening. And then that led to a huge big backlash. And eventually the government was forced to U-turn and Owen Paterson resigned as an MP. So on the one hand, you might say, well, that kind of suggests that the system at the moment isn't strong enough. The government shouldn't have been able to try to step in and stop that suspension from going through. You might think we need to have a stronger role for regulators and rules in order to stop that from happening. On the other hand, you might say, well, actually, the political process worked there. The government tried to do something that really wasn't ethically appropriate, and there was a big backlash. Politics kicked in. There was a public outcry, a media outcry, and the government was forced to back down. So you can see those different mechanisms operating very clearly in that case, producing the outcome. If we think about a different principle, though, we will find ourselves somewhere else on that spectrum. So if we think, for example, about the principle of honesty and that politicians should speak truthfully and shouldn't be dishonest, well, the system is going to tend to be a bit more towards the end of relying on politics here, just because regulators tend to be very concerned about intervening in questions about what politicians are and are not allowed to say. It can get very heated, very contentious as to what is true and what is not true, what's misleading and what's not misleading. So on that kind of issue, relying on political accountability and people coming to their own judgment of what they make of the claims that are being made by different politicians is a bigger part of what we normally do. So that's how it works in the UK at the moment. Of course, the question for you is to consider, how should this work? How should this system of maintaining ethical standards operate? So that's the first question. Then the second question is, to what extent should government and parliament be subject to legal limits? And again, at one end of the spectrum, we have the view that the politics should dominate, that voters should be in charge and be able to control the outcomes. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the view that actually we need legal limits on what government and parliament can do, because we need protections so that those in power are not able to act against the interests of the rest of us, for example. So now this question, as we said in the morning, has kind of two areas of focus within it. So there's government there and there's also parliament. And just how things work at the moment in the UK is different, depending on whether we're talking about limits on government or limits on parliament. So let me start off with the question about parliament. And should there be legal limits on the laws that government can pass? So as Chris explained in his talk this morning, the traditional system in the UK is one in which politics dominates, in which we rely entirely on, or relied entirely on, those political mechanisms of representation and accountability, us choosing our representatives, Parliament operating and scrutinising what the executive is doing, and us being able to hold our representatives to account. So that was the traditional system in the UK. And of course, the argument for that is that's democracy. And we have this principle of parliamentary sovereignty, that Parliament can pass any law that it wishes. On the other hand, other democracies, Chris mentioned particularly the United States, but actually most democracies have this kind of system. The courts can really impose quite strong limits on what laws the Parliament can pass. And these are countries that have a fully written out constitution that sets out various requirements, various rules on rights and on how the democratic system will operate. And Parliament just can't straightforwardly pass any kind of law in order that would break those basic principles. And if it did try to do so, if a parliament in a country like that does try to introduce such laws, then the courts can strike down those laws. They can make those laws no longer be laws. They can just remove them from the list of laws. Now, the UK, as again Chris explained, has kind of moved over the last quarter century or so that now the UK is somewhere in the middle between these two different ends of the spectrum. And that's for several reasons. Chris mentioned several reasons for that. But maybe the most important one is the Human Rights Act. And that was a piece of legislation that was passed by Parliament in 1998. And in that piece of legislation, Parliament set out a list of rights that it thought was particularly important. And it basically said that if a law is passed and people think that law might violate the rights in the Human Rights Act, then it's possible to take that matter to court and for the courts to decide, does this new law actually violate the rights in the Human Rights Act? But that's in the middle of the spectrum there, rather than being over towards the United States end and the end of most democracies. Because if the courts declare that a piece of legislation, a law, is incompatible with the Human Rights Act, that doesn't stop being law. Rather, the matter goes back to Parliament, and Parliament is asked to think again. Do you really want to pass this law that violates the basic rights that you've set out, that Parliament has set out as being important? And Parliament then makes a decision. Do we want the law to stand or not? And generally speaking, Parliament decides to change the law so that it is compatible with the Human Rights Act. So you can see there's various different positions that have been taken in the UK and are taken in other countries along that spectrum. And then our final question is on how do we ensure that government ministers act within their powers? So here, the traditional UK model is somewhere more in the middle of the spectrum. So it's always been the case that the courts in the UK have been able to make decisions on whether government ministers are acting within their powers or not. That's always been the case. Traditionally, though, as Chris said, the courts were quite reluctant to use those powers in a very active way. They preferred to defer to what the political representatives, the government and Parliament, had chosen. And their view was basically that, well, if Parliament didn't like what government was doing, then Parliament could always intervene and stop the government from doing that. As Chris said, they've tended to move over time a bit more towards the courts being more active, more activist is the word that is sometimes used, being more willing to stand up to the ministers and government and say, no, actually, you can't do that, that it's outside your powers. And there's a big debate going on at the moment about just where should we lie in this system. Should we welcome the fact that the courts are playing a bigger role now and perhaps are protecting the system against government ministers who try to stretch beyond the powers that they actually have? Or would it be better if we left that more to Parliament to hold government ministers to account? So those are the questions that we're exploring this afternoon, and that's what we've learnt so far about them from the talks this morning, very briefly. So just to sum up, we're thinking, what should be the role of politics in upholding basic principles within our political system? What should be the roles of rules in upholding those basic principles? And what's the best balance between these? Given that no one argues that we should have just politics or just rules, everyone thinks there should be some kind of balance. Just where should that balance lie? And finally, how do our answers to these questions depend on which of the basic principles we have in mind? We might well have a different answer depending on whether we're talking about rights or democratic principles or standards of ethical behavior or whatever it might be. Okay, so that's enough from me. Back now to Kayla.
You can see the problem in the Supreme Court's judgment about the prorogation of Parliament in September 2019. In that case, it seems to me, the Supreme Court invented new law, deciding for itself what the Prime Minister should have done, rather than leaving this to the political process. That's not the way our Constitution has traditionally settled what should be done, and it's not an improvement. Thank you.
Okay, and we're just going to take that 1 minute now to sort of note down any thoughts, any questions that you might have around that, anything you want to sort of clarify, and make sure you remember by the time we get back to our discussions later in the afternoon. Okay, and now I'll hand back to Meg for our next speaker.
Thanks, Kayla, and thanks very much, Richard, for that introduction. Our next speaker is Professor Catherine Barnard. She's Professor of European and Employment Law at the University of Cambridge. And amongst other things, she's also the Deputy Director of the UK and in a Changing Europe initiative, which is based out of King's College London, and considers the changing relationship between the UK and the EU. So she's going to give us a slightly different view, I think, about the role of the courts. Over to you, Catherine.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's terrific to be with you today. Now, you might think that as a professor of law that I will defend the courts and their role in the UK Constitution. I should say at the outset that I would never recommend anyone going to court. It's expensive and stressful, and the outcome is never guaranteed. I would always urge people to find other ways of resolving their disputes if possible. That said, I do think the courts have an important role to play in our system. They act as referees between the two sides. So far, you've heard lots about courts hearing public law matters, as Richard was talking about, i.e., where the courts are hearing challenges to the behaviour of government. I just want to start by reminding you that, of course, the courts do so much more than that. Every day they hear hundreds of disputes involving individuals or companies suing each other over, for example, breaches of contracts. So if Tesco's has sold me a faulty kettle, I will sue for that. And at their best, disputes in courts are heard by independent judges who give both sides a chance to have their say. Decision is made, which hopefully goes in my favour, and I win against Tesco's. But the decision is reasoned to explain why I win and not Tesco's. And it's really important to remember that courts do this because this is important to the civilised society. It avoids either side resorting to more drastic measures. You've got an independent arbitrator. And this question of the legitimacy of judges comes from the fact that they are trained, they're qualified, they are selected in an independent way, as we heard this morning, and they are experts. And crucially, if the government doesn't like the direction of travel taken by the courts, it can ask Parliament to legislate, either to reverse the decision or perhaps even to uphold it. Now, I've just said something about private disputes, disputes between me and Tesco's or me and another person, to remind you that the court's role goes way beyond just public law matters. But I want to turn now specifically to the public law issues that Richard was talking about. And just to remind you, when we're talking about public law issues, it's a situation when a private individual, you or me, or an interest group, such as a trade union, challenges a decision taken by the government. And I'll give you a concrete example. It's based on a real case. So the government decided some years ago to introduce fees for individuals going through an employment tribunal. So the employment tribunal is a tribunal which hears cases about unfair dismissal or discrimination law. And these fees were set at quite a high level, and they bore no relation to the amount of damages being claimed. Now, these fees were introduced by secondary legislation. Remember, you've got Acts of Parliament at the top and secondary legislation underneath. This secondary legislation, it was introduced by the executive without getting the full scrutiny of Parliament. Now, after the fees were introduced, the number of claims fell off a cliff. Indeed, about 80% of claims fell away. And there was evidence that quite a lot of meritorious claims were not being heard. And remember, because meritorious claims were not being heard, employers were getting away with breaking the law, i.e. a law which was mainly laid down by Parliament. So Unison, which is a very large trade union, sought judicial review of those rules which introduced fees. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that these rules deprived individuals of their access to justice. It was contrary to the rule of law, and these fees were therefore unlawful. So now claimants don't have to pay fees anymore. Now, it's worth remembering at this point, if you're thinking about judicial overreach, as perhaps Richard might argue, that there is absolutely nothing to stop Parliament from legislating to introduce fees through an Act of Parliament, and that would go through the full scrutiny process. of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. I just want to turn finally to the question about human rights, which Richard so eloquently spoke about. Now, I imagine that some of you listening to this will say, look, the courts have gone way too far in protecting the rights of migrants, asylum seekers, criminals, terrorists, and therefore this has made the country much less safe. And there's a well-known case decided some years ago, which effectively stopped the UK from deporting a very dangerous individual to a country where he was likely to be subject to torture. And a lot of people thought this was a really very bad decision, and human rights, this is an example of human rights gone mad. Now, what's interesting here is that the judges said states are not allowed to combat international terrorism at all costs. They must not seek to undermine the very values that they seek to protect. In other words, you can't subject somebody to torture in the name of protecting the greater good, because this goes against the values of our democratic system, and it's for the court to ensure that those values are protected. I want to make just a couple of points specifically on human rights. Remember, the court's job is about upholding the rule of law. A system based on the rule of law, that includes human rights. Secondly, the Human Rights Act 1998, the one you've heard about quite a lot, was an act of Parliament introduced by the government. It went through the parliamentary process, and it empowers the courts to apply the principles of the convention. Yes, sometimes the courts may get it wrong, which is why there's a system of appeal, and ultimately Parliament can intervene if they think the courts have indeed got matters wrong. And indeed, it's interesting to note how rarely Parliament does, in fact, intervene post hoc in a decision taken by the court. The final point to note is it could be you. Now, you might be thinking, well, I'm not a terrorist or an asylum seeker, but just think, if the government decided to knock down your house to build a road, or to take away your child based on a rumour that you were not caring for the child properly, wouldn't you want to go to court to protest? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So again, we'll just take that minute to note down anything. I know, some of that might have, there was a lot of information there. It's a little bit hard to hear at some points, Catherine, so we might need to look at that over the break, but just take a minute and we'll come back for our third speaker soon. Back to you, Meg.
Great, thanks, Kayla. And thank you very much, Catherine. So our final speaker will be familiar to, I think, pretty much everybody in the room. Jill Rutter has spoken at the Assembly, I think not once, but twice before. So if you've missed her, you haven't been paying attention. She's here today to talk to us more about the issues of standards in public life and the role of regulators. And just a reminder that Jill is a senior fellow at a think tank called the Institute for Government, which aims to make government more effective. So she doesn't work for the government, she's independent of the government, but earlier in her career, she has held various senior civil service roles in different departments, including in 10 Downing Street itself. So she's very well qualified to talk to us about this subject. Over to you, Jill.
Hey, thanks very much, Meg, and thanks very much to Catherine and Richard for their presentation. I'm going to go, as Meg said, I'm going to go on to a slightly different tangent to Meg and Richard, but ultimately we come back to some of the same issues, which is about who has the sort of last say on things. So we've talked a bit about the law, we've talked quite a lot about politics as a source of constraints, but what we saw, and we saw particularly in Jane's talk this morning, is in between there's a bit of a grey zone, these things we call standards, conventions, and about the bodies that usually ministers have set up to act as watchdogs on standards. And she pointed out that they work in varying ways and have different sets of powers. So what I thought I would do for my 5 minutes is just sort of give you some examples of how these work in practice. So you can think about whether you're happy with the way those work, or whether you think they need some degree of strengthening. So I think Meg gave us a hint in the break that you talked quite a bit about that recent case with Owen Paterson, the former MP for North Shropshire. So let's just look and see what happened to Owen Paterson. And it's quite interesting about how these things play out. Owen Paterson was investigated by the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, who's in charge of ensuring that MPs observe their code of conduct. Remember, they agree what's in that code of conduct. She was asked to look at his case about whether he'd been lobbying and been paid to do so, which you're not allowed to do. And she looked at it and said she thought he had breached the rules. His case then went to a committee, the Parliamentary Standards Committee, and that has, as Jane said, a bunch of lay people sitting alongside MPs. They looked at the Commissioner's report, agreed with her that he had breached the rules, and recommended the punishment, but they didn't have the final say. That was for MPs. But when that came to MPs, asking them, as in convention they usually do, to sign off the 30-day suspension they'd recommended for Owen Paterson, the government used its majority, so that political constraint that Richard was talking about, to make sure that that punishment didn't go through immediately. They will say they were dealing with a different issue, but that was the immediate effect of what the government did then. But ultimately, as those of you who read through to the end will know, Owen Paterson ended up resigning. Why did he resign? Not because Parliament had said he had to resign. Actually, Parliament at the time was letting him off that punishment immediately, but because he couldn't cope with the political backlash that had followed in Parliament and from the public, both about his actions, but also the way in which government had handled it. So do we take out of that the system was not very good because actually it couldn't enforce a punishment, or actually there's nothing to be worried about because ultimately politics achieved the result that an MP who'd been found in breach of the rules ended up reconsidering his position and left Parliament. Let's take another example, this time about how we make sure ministers behave properly in public office. Jane told you about the ministerial code, which the Prime Minister issues. Actually, the Prime Minister doesn't actually have to issue it, but Prime Ministers have in recent years always issued a ministerial code. Last year, the Prime Minister asked his advisor on ministerial interests to investigate allegations of bullying against the Home Secretary. Those of you who are employees will know that one of the things you're not supposed to do is bully other members of staff. The Prime Minister asked his advisor to investigate. He did a report. The Prime Minister eventually published that report, and we found that the advisor had said he did think that Priti Patel had breached the ministerial code. Normally, the convention is that in those circumstances, the minister who's broken the code would resign. But the Prime Minister said he actually didn't think that Priti Patel had done anything that warranted resignation. Instead, the advisor resigned because advice hadn't been taken. He thought his role had been undermined. The government decided it could tough it out. And if you watch the news this week, you'll notice that both the Prime Minister and Priti Patel were right in their judgment that they could tough it out. They're both still in office. So what about that case? Are we worried there that the sanction hasn't been gone through? Or are we actually quite pleased that, you know, the Prime Minister got to say and got the final say on who was in his cabinet? That's one of the things Jane said, that ultimately it has to be the Prime Minister who decides who's in his cabinet. But remember, that's not an absolute rule. If instead of bullying, the charge against a minister had been one that had been through the criminal courts and they'd been subject to a prison sentence of over a year, they'd have automatically been chucked out of Parliament and then they couldn't have held a ministerial job. So there are some occasions when the Prime Minister's discretion on who he appoints is limited. And let me give you finally a third example. It's also been in the news quite a lot recently. And that's about not about how we make these, how we enforce standards, but who enforces them. We've talked quite a lot about all these public bodies. The people who run those are subject to a process called the public appointments process. And again, this is an area where we don't set it out in law. We have some guidance about the processes ministers are supposed to follow when they appoint people to run these bodies. That's supposed to guarantee the independence of the process. An independent panel assesses candidates, and they then tell ministers who they think can do the job, in the jargon, who is appointable. And the minister, and ultimately the most important prime minister appointments, the prime minister can pick a candidate from that list of appointable candidates. But they can also actually appoint someone who applied that the panel thought was unappointable, as long as they're prepared to explain themselves to Parliament and the public. In some cases, there are processes where, for really important appointments, there's a pre-appointment hearing with a parliamentary committee. But there's only one case where ministers have put into law that the committee can turn down a candidate. Otherwise, even if the committee thinks they're absolute rubbish, ministers can still go ahead and appoint if they think they can manage the politics around it. And of course, it's up to ministers to decide whether to change the guidance or not. So one of the things you want to think about is it enough to rely on guidance? Should we put these codes onto a proper legal basis, give people legal powers, leave it to judges or to independent enforcement bodies to decide whether rules have been broken and what the sanction should be? But remember, as Richard's pointed out to us, ultimately this all comes down to Parliament. So Parliament can make and it can unmake those rules that are put in place to regulate behaviour. So in the final analysis, the real sanction is not with judges, not even with the politicians themselves in some ways, but with the public. So the reason that we have many of these rules, guidance, these bodies in place is that they're a response to public outcry when there's been a scandal, when people think that politicians have gone too far and need to be reined in. So big question, can we do more to make sure that sanction works better and that voters pay attention to what is going on and the way our parliamentarians and others behave?
Thank you very much, Jill. So different perspectives there. People starting not just to tell you about what the situation currently is, but draw out some of the questions and bring forward opinions on what should happen. We're going to have a little break now till 15:15. So it is only 7.5 minutes this time. 15:15, we're going to restart because actually we've got a bit of a panel discussion to hear from to sort of tease out some of these ideas a bit more. So take a break and see you at 15:15. Okay, I think it is time that we will get started. So I'm going to, as I said, this is going to be a bit of a discussion. We've been taking some of the questions that we know came up during the morning, and we had a bit of a chat over lunch. Meg's had a bit of a chat with some of the speakers. So we're going to be picking up on lots of these questions. But again, a reminder, when you go into the groups later, the speakers are still going to be around all afternoon. So if there's specific things that don't get covered that you want to ask more about, they're available to come and chat to your group. But now over to you, Meg.
Brilliant, thanks, Kayla. And we've got very little time for this session and lots to cover. So I'll try and ask short questions, and I would really appreciate short answers from the speakers. I'm going to throw the same question to all of you to start off with. We've discussed quite a lot today how all of these things are matters of balance. It's a question of where we are on a spectrum between who has the power. And I would like to ask all of you, do you think we've got the balance right at the moment, or should we be moving in one way or the other? Richard doesn't want too much judicial power. Catherine doesn't want too little. Have we got it right and we shouldn't have any more or any less? Or have we got it wrong in some way? And Jill, do you think the regulators have enough power at the moment? Richard?
Sure, thank you. So no, I don't think we've got the balance quite right just now, although depends at what level of detail you look, I suppose. So I would, Catherine spoke, as I did, about the Human Rights Act. I would amend it or possibly even repeal it. I think we had the balance better between political authorities and the courts a few years back. So although there's much to be said for the central place Parliament has, I think we are a little bit out of balance.
Okay, lovely short answer. Catherine, do you think we've got it right at the moment, or should the judges have more power?
No, not more power, but I think we're broadly about where it should be. The fact is the courts can rule. The courts are extremely sensitive to the allegation that they are doing politics by other means. In other words, that they're being used as a political vehicle or as a political tool. And you often see judges reject cases as they say that this is not appropriate, or they say our role is simply to check on procedure, not to look at the merits. And even if they think the minister has got the decision wrong, they will not interfere. It's really important to have the courts there as a check on power.
Okay, terrific. And Jill, the same with regulators. You might think they've got too much power, or maybe you think they've got too little, or have we got it about right and we should protect what we've got?
No, I think that ministers have too much discretion. I think regulators probably need to be more independent, and the political price for ignoring them should probably be a bit higher. It's too easy to do that, and the conventions surrounding them become too weak.
Okay, lovely. Let me stick with Jill for a minute, just to sort of keep some continuity. One of the things that members were saying this morning was, if these regulators don't have teeth, what is the point of having them at all? We've got all this regulatory kind of infrastructure, but they can't force decisions. Would you go along with that sort of cynicism, or do you think they're actually useful even without teeth, although you want them strengthened?
So what they do is they shine a light on issues. And that's why I think transparency comes down to end up as being really quite important. So if you think about these things, what do these bodies do? They raise the political price of doing something by exposing it and forcing ministers. Take the Owen Paterson case. They sort of, ministers were forced to override the results of that process rather than it just happen automatically. And why did Owen Paterson end up resigning? Because there was a big political backlash against the way in which the government had handled that. So they're about raising the political price to do that. And we do quite a lot of that in government across a lot of areas. We don't stop ministers doing things, but we make it politically a bit more hard. They can't do it behind the scenes.
That's a really interesting example, that they put the information out there, don't they? If you hadn't had the regulators, we wouldn't have even known about the Owen Paterson case, I suppose.
Yeah, and the question is that enough? Is that enough for us, or do we actually want to beef them up a bit more? And that's why, just quickly, one of these issues about the advisor on ministerial interests is who gets to decide what they investigate. Is it the Prime Minister, which is the current position, or should that advisor be able to do it just because they think there's a problem?
Yeah, okay. Good to try and stick to some of these examples, I think. It makes it more real for people. So it was really appreciated that both Richard and Catherine used examples of cases to support their own case. So Richard, you talked about the Prorogation case and how you thought the judges had gone too far. And Catherine, you talked about that case, the Unison case, which is about paying fees to go to employment tribunals, and you thought that the courts were useful. Would you like to respond to each other's cases? Richard, do you disapprove of the case that Catherine cited? And
no, I'm afraid not.
What's your argument on prorogation?
No, so I mean, the Unison case is a case that Catherine and many other excellent lawyers approve of heartily, but I think it was mistaken. Because I think Parliament had given the job of deciding what level of fees should be set to the Lord Chancellor, and it was the Lord Chancellor's job to decide that. And the court had a role in supervising it, for sure. I mean, it's the many ways the Lord Chancellor could misuse that power, including by setting a sort of an irrational level of fee. But that wasn't what the court concluded. The court effectively concluded the Lord Chancellor has to get it right. And we'll decide if he's got it right. Has he set it just the right level to discourage a certain number of cases, but
just to be clear, you think the court did a good thing there or did a bad thing?
No. I think the court ended up taking over for itself the job that Parliament had given the Lord Chancellor, deciding what the right level of fees should be. And the court says, well, the Lord Chancellor is acting for a proper purpose here, perfectly proper to recover some of the costs of the tribunal system from people who are applying, perfectly proper to try and encourage people to settle their disputes. the court just thought, well, we wouldn't have set it at this level. Now, that's not the court's job, I think. And it was a political controversy for the reasons that Catherine outlined, namely the number of cases seems to fall, and is this the right way to do it? Perfectly proper for the Lord Chancellor to come under a whole lot of pressure to change the position. But I think the court ended up deciding that instead of the Lord Chancellor. And that
very interesting. I think, to put it in the terms that the members have heard before, Parliament had given the Lord Chancellor the power to make secondary legislation, and the Lord Chancellor had used that to set the fees higher, and the court said he'd gone too far. So you would be on the side of the Lord Chancellor there, whereas Catherine says that the court was right to intervene and to send it back to Parliament. Catherine, what do you say on the prorogation case that Richard raised? Do you think the courts went too far there?
So there were two issues in the prorogation case. One, should the court even hear the case at all? And I think the answer probably was absolutely correct on that they should have done, although the views are divided on that. On the more difficult question on looking at the issue of prorogation, what the court said was that this was a power that the executive had, but the power was used in such an excessive way. Remember, the prorogation was for not the usual 3 or 4 days, but 5 weeks at the most sensitive time in the Brexit negotiation process. And because it was used in such an excessive way, it undermined the rule of law, to undermine the role of Parliament, because Parliament essentially was turned off. It wasn't allowed to sit during that time, and therefore the court said Parliament should be allowed to sit and debate some of these most sensitive issues at the time. So I think on balance, the court probably got it right, because it essentially empowered Parliament to do what Parliament was there to do.
Okay, a Parliament comes into all of these examples, I think, doesn't it? And I mean, Parliament is my thing, as members know. I do wonder whether all of this is about a failure of Parliament in some way. And Jill, you talked about the ministerial code. The ministerial code is controlled by the Prime Minister. In the Priti Patel case, the Prime Minister got advice from a regulator and chose not to follow it and got away with it. Was that a failure by Parliament? Was the political process failing there?
Well, maybe, but should she have bullied her staff? No. Should it be an automatic sanction that she has to go for a breach of the code? It's just a convention. But actually, I want to come back on the prorogation case, because I think that's a really interesting example, though the two lawyers will no doubt disagree with me and say this is very naive. Because what we've always depended on before is, on some of these cases, is actually the regulator. Isn't anyone we appoint. It's supposed to be actually the Queen. Because why do you not go and ask the Queen to prorogue Parliament in circumstances that looked like you're doing it for narrow political benefit? Because you would embarrass the Queen. That used to be, when I was a civil servant, if any civil servant said we can't do that, that would embarrass the Queen. The government would run a mile from doing it. But now you actually have a position where ministers don't feel so constrained by that. You can't do that. That would appear to be drawing the Queen into politics if we went and asked for this sort of thing to do. The problem with the prorogation was that they asked. And I'm sure that most of the civil service advice would have been, you shouldn't be asking in this case. So we have all these things that depend on having ministers who are embarrassed by breaking conventions, and the breakdown comes, and when you look at the things again, is if they don't appear to be as embarrassed as earlier generations thought they should be.
So in your area, is it a case of wanting to give regulators more enforceable powers? I mean, Jane showed us that diagram earlier on, when you've got some regulators which are just created by the Prime Minister, some are accountable to Parliament, and then some, like the Electoral Commission, actually have enforceable powers, which begins to get you into the area of the courts having some role. Do you think more regulators should have enforceable powers?
I mean, I think the question is, do they have powers to do things under their own authority? And it's ultimately, as Richard would say, for Parliament to decide whether to give them those powers. They don't create them themselves. Parliament decides to give them. the trouble with all these regulators is in a system where ultimately it comes down to the sovereignty of Parliament. If, and we're seeing this at the moment with proposals to change the powers of the Electoral Commission, if ultimately a government with a majority decides it's created a regulator and they become too powerful, they're using their powers in the way that the government with its majority, that Parliament doesn't like, then ultimately those regulators can be abolished. It's harder to abolish ones that are set up in statute because you have to go to Parliament and ask them to abolish them than one that's just set up in an ad hoc way that I'd like to have this advisor. Oh, actually, I don't really want that advisor anymore, so I won't bother to appoint somebody and the post falls away. But ultimately, in a system like ours, it comes down at the end of the day to Parliament. And one of the interesting things is that many of these bodies, we have these independent bodies, ministers are always going on about how much they dislike what they call quangos. Don't know if you've heard those independent bodies with their powers, because actually those powers should be with democratically elected politicians rather than unelected bureaucrats who are appointed by ministers. But actually, the moment there's a scandal and ministers want to say, no, we're dealing with that scandal, they instantly grab for, I'm creating an independent person to do this. I'm setting up an independent body. And look, we're taking it away from politicians because you can trust these nice independent people. It's nothing to do with us guys. And so we've always got this sort of tension between, it should be us, we're the democratic people, we've got the mandate, versus we're ducking out, we're giving it over to these two law professors. They're really respectable people and they'll make great independent judgments.
I'm not so sure about that.
Let me bring the others in because we're going to run out of time. Richard, you said we need to hold on tightly to parliamentary sovereignty. You're very much defending Parliament. But when we talk about parliamentary sovereignty, are we really talking about Parliament or are we talking about ministers? Because on this case that you were talking about, you're talking about the Lord Chancellor being able to exercise powers to do something that Parliament hadn't even seen. So where should those limits lie in terms of what ministers can do without Parliament seeing it? And shouldn't the courts be able to step in those instances where ministers go too far?
Well, if a minister goes beyond the scope of the power that Parliament gave to him or her, then absolutely the court should step in. But the court, I think, doesn't have a role to remake the power or to decide that Parliament's giving too much power to the minister. Parliament might well have. That's a live political controversy, and parliamentarians will rightly debate that, and law professors will criticise them for their judgments there. It is, I mean, our system is one of parliamentary government, as you know, so the government has a sort of very significant role within Parliament, but that tension there, I think, is a productive one. And in relation to the Unison case, it's not that the Lord Chancellor was making fees with no engagement with Parliament. It's exercising a power to make secondary legislation that Parliament had conferred, and parliamentarians had noticed and were paying attention and were trying to bring political pressure to bear on the government. It wasn't a sort of secret course of action or anything like that. So I mean, the Unison case is I think a slightly startling one, because the court really does get into, well, what level of fees should they be? And that, I think, is not for the court, even if it does feel a kind of proprietorial interest in the courts.
Catherine, do you think things could have been improved here if Parliament had been stronger? If Parliament had been able to confront the Lord Chancellor about the fees without it even going to court?
I think they were, actually. That was good.
I was asking Catherine.
Oh, sorry, forgive me.
Listen, I mean, absolutely, we have a system of parliamentary government, but it's not exclusively parliamentary government. There are three branches of government, as you've heard a lot about in this series of lectures: the executive, Parliament, and the courts, and they are in a constructive tension. And specifically on the Unison case, just to remind you, this was the one about the employment tribunal fees. Remember, as a result of the level that the fees had been set, they were set very high level. they 80% of cases stopped going to the courts almost overnight. So there were a lot of people who were being denied access to justice. And the fact was that Parliament had not intervened in any way to deal with this very specific problem of people not being able to get their case heard. To give you a really concrete example, we're doing a lot of work with EU migrants who are very poor indeed. And the way employers make money on out of poor people is that by not paying them their full pay. So £50 would be cut from their salary. They would have had to pay £500 to go to an employment tribunal to try and get the £50 back. And then you've got Phoenix employers who disappear overnight. So these people were effectively being denied access to justice. And it was this very issue that the courts, and remember the courts are there to ensure people have access to justice, the courts eventually intervened in the Unison case.
I've been given a 2-minute warning, so let me ask you one last question, all of you. Are there things that you think Parliament shouldn't be able to do, or that the Prime Minister shouldn't be able to do? Richard, can I ask you that about Parliament? And I guess I'll ask Catherine that as well, and Jill, whether there are things the Prime Minister shouldn't be able to do, and who should stop them?
Well, there are things, it depends what you mean by should, I suppose. There are things Parliament shouldn't do because it's not capable of doing them. So Parliament shouldn't try and run a murder trial on its own. It shouldn't be giving awfully specific directives to chief constables, perhaps, either. There is sort of a level of operational detail that Parliament's not capable of handling. And likewise, Parliament shouldn't try and micromanage foreign policy, by legislation at least. It can hold to account the government's overarching policy and so on, but it can mistake its institutional position and make mistakes exercising its power. Now, I don't think you shouldn't be able to go off to a court and correct Parliament's misuse of legislation, or even silly things parliamentarians do in the course of parliamentary proceedings. But parliamentarians should think we've got a certain job to do, but not everything.
Okay, very quickly, Catherine, I think Parliament should be prevented from doing, and by whom?
Yeah, so my biggest concern about Parliament is that there's an increasing use of legislation which gives huge powers to the government, to the executive, to make secondary legislation, as in the Unison case, and as we know, secondary legislation gets almost no scrutiny. There's not been a piece of secondary legislation that's been rejected since the late 1970s. And because so much power is being delegated by Parliament to the executive, there is real concern about the scope of those powers that are given to the government, which impact people on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, I hope that members can begin to see the tie-up between these topics and some of the ones we discussed in week 3 when we were talking about Parliament and government, and how much power government should be able to exercise independent of Parliament. Jill, you get the last word. Are there things the Prime Minister shouldn't be able to do, and who should be able to stop him? Is that just the job of Parliament, or is there a role here for regulators and judges?
It's very difficult in our system to see who can stop a Prime Minister with a majority doing things given parliamentary primacy. But I think some of the things that we might want to think about whether we can find a way of reducing power is to stack the odds in favour of staying in power, if you like, by avoiding scrutiny, avoiding letting voters know what's going on, appointing all their mates to run things. And I think one of the really interesting things in a case where the government is taking back power in a way Richard probably thinks is absolutely great, I'm not sure about Catherine, is the power to decide when to call elections. Lots of other countries have fixed term cycles for elections. We had that briefly where ministers had to go to Parliament, get Parliament's approval for doing that under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, but this government's legislating to take that back. Now, do we think that? Because that means the Prime Minister can say, well, what's the best moment for my political advantage to do that? Not when is it in the best interest of the country, or is it actually going to be a sort of fixed schedule so I know what I'm doing? So I think we ought to think about how far we stack the odds, allow them to stack the odds in favour of them staying in power.
Let me stop you there. Thank you so much. And that also illustrates the tie-ups of that previous government and Parliament week. And when government and Parliament can't sort things out among themselves, that's when it ends up with other people like the courts and the regulators. That was a whirlwind. Back to you, Kayla.
Yeah, that's look, fascinating discussion. Lots of things coming up there, and we're going to put you into the breakout rooms for a little while now, through till about 4:15. We've given you some scenarios to consider to try and ground some of these different debates in, a particular scenario, but really it's about exploring some of these issues and starting to feel where do we feel these sort of balance of authority collide. Remember, our speakers are here, so if it will add value to your conversation, please do let us know and we'll get them to you. And now we'll open up the breakout rooms. Here comes everybody. So I think we've got all of the breakout rooms closed now and everyone back online with us. So we did give you some examples there to consider, but really the questions that we were focusing on was this: where should, in a good democracy, these types of decisions be being made? Who has the authority to actually, create these limits or regulate what should be happening? So we're going to give people each group's got about 1 minute to sort of give us a sense of, did you come to a conclusion? Or what were some of the real tensions that you were debating about where these sorts of decisions should be made? So 3 of the groups started with thinking about what we were talking about much earlier in the day, these some ethical standards of behaviour for elected members or elected representatives. So I'm going to start there. And I think from group 1, we've got Amber, who's going to feed back for us. Amber, are you there?
Sorry, my computer was playing up there. Sorry. Yeah, so do you want me to say like the different scenarios that we as a group collectively what we thought?
Yeah, if you want to just tell us the scenario briefly. It was about, who should be able to make the decision.
Yeah.
Just the first scenario, Amber. Just speak to that first scenario, A.
Yeah, just the first one.
So then which should have the power to decide? So we talked about the importance of the courts, about having a clear role in the courts for removing the person, about how Parliament have an important role and regulators are also valid. So our group were all between the line between Parliament, courts and regulators. I'd say sort of 2 were near the courts, 2 were on the line. Collectively, we sort of put it between the line between the courts and Parliament, and then 2 were more sort of in the middle between the courts and regulators, but everybody was sort of the closer side to the courts. Okay,
and main reason, do you think, just wanted to have the teeth?
I think it was just everyone was trying to sort of think of the fairest way that things can be given. And also from the speakers today, there were lots of valid points about how if things hadn't gone to court, maybe the outcome would have been different, or they may have been let off.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Amber. That was great. And so really they're thinking about, if there's clear evidence that a minister in the government has behaved corruptly or lied to Parliament, who should have the authority to remove them? So I'm going to come to group 2 now. So that is Andy, I think, ready to feedback.
I'm just going to share screen for Andy.
Yep.
And you get a sense of all the different views in the group as well.
Thank you, Hayley. As a group, we came to the consensus that the regulators and Parliament need to be involved. As you can see from the screen, we also had a feeling that the courts and the government should be involved. Generally, we agreed, as I say, regulators and Parliament. My position involved the courts because I believe that the regulators should have the ability to shine a spotlight on a misdemeanor or whatever by a minister. The courts should have the position to provide a judiciary review and say this is what he's done wrong for definite, etc., etc., and then it should go back to Parliament. My position was to remove the government to prevent bias and also the overruling. If they can get it through Parliament, good. Another member of the group thought that the government should be involved because you then go back to parliamentary sovereignty. So in general, we agreed that you do need the regulators and Parliament involved, but we had slight diversions as to how much the courts and how much government should actually be involved. In general, it was very interesting. That's it.
Thanks, Andy. And the third group that we're asking feedback on that first scenario that you looked at is group 3. And I think Janet, our facilitator, is going to feedback on behalf of that group. Just very briefly so that we can get through to...
Yes, nobody wanted to volunteer. I'll just share the screen briefly just to let you see that there was no real consensus in our group. So there was probably a consensus that the government shouldn't be very involved because the minister is part of the government, and so the temptation would be to close ranks and protect that person. So a couple of people were keen that Parliament should have a strong role because Parliament's the kind of bigger team that person is let down, and is in this ideal democracy that we have is going to be representative. But there was some role there as well for the courts, who, although they're not elected, are independent. But there was also concern about whether they have the clout, because we've heard that they can sway back and forth depending how much pressure they feel from the government in terms of how strong they are in challenging the government. And then there was one view that the regulators should also have a role, because in this ideal democracy, regulators would be completely independent and have real powers, and so then they would therefore have a role.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to move on now to scenario B, and I'm going to have to ask people just to keep it quite brief so that we all the groups get a chance to feedback. Just make sure that, give us the key tensions. We don't need to necessarily know every point, but it's great to know. So this one was around limiting the laws that Parliament can actually pass, okay? And so, who should be able to decide that, a law that potentially some people believe violates human rights, whether Parliament, whether that can be passed by Parliament. So I'm going to come, I don't know if we have a volunteer from group 4, or Anita, can I just call on you very briefly?
Yeah, I'll have to confess, I actually didn't get to inviting people, so I'll just quickly feed that back by also sharing the screen so that you can see. So it was overwhelmingly that the group thought the government should have the power to decide, because people felt that government more realistic, but also that referendum was a really important part of that as well. But then we did obviously have an outlier who felt the courts were really that the court should have the power to decide. And I'll just read from the note there. If government, Parliament have approved a law that contradicts basic human rights, there needs to be a procedural mechanism to challenge this. And it's not pragmatic to have a referendum each time. So that's our group.
Thank you very much. Again, if sharing the screen is helpful, do, but it's also good to see the people who are talking. So Emily, I think, actually, Emily, you're feeding back on behalf of your group as well. That was agreed?
I am, yeah. So quite a lot of interest in our group around Parliament. We didn't come to a consensus, so I'll share the kind of thoughts from some in the group. So lots of thinking about Parliament, but in combination with others. So somebody suggested Parliament, but with advice and input from the judges and courts. Others saying that it should be Parliament first, but the final say sits with judges and the courts. And then another suggestion around Parliament, but with input from regulators. So having the regulators watching over perhaps a human rights regulator in the case of human rights breach.
Okay, so again, we've got lots of different opinions here, but we're starting to see what are the key tensions, and this is something we'll be exploring much more tomorrow. Latoya, can I call on you for group 6?
Yeah, for this one, it was quite a the whole group agreed that they wanted the courts to be able to arbitrate on that. And the main reason really was that the group felt that human rights need to be upheld legally. There needs to be a legal framework to do that, and the intervention should be a legal one.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, that ability to override Parliament if there really has been something that challenges human rights. We're going to move on to the next scenario now, which was actually about, if there's a dispute over whether a democratically elected government has the authority to decide a new law on its own, or whether it needs parliamentary approval, okay? So really deciding who should have the power to decide whether the government can actually act and bring in new laws themselves. So, and that comes back to what we were talking earlier about ensuring that government and ministers act within the powers that have been granted to them. So I think we've got, from Group 8, we've got Louise.
Hi, hello. So generally for this one, we felt that this should lie with Parliament, but very important that it's ensured that the citizens' voice is heard regarding this, and that there has to be some independent scrutiny for expertise and impact.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Nice and clear thing there that your group sounded like it was coming together.
So just really quickly, you can see on the screen where it is. So most of the group panned out a kind of a balance between government and Parliament. Although a couple of people did say that it could be a role for the regulators, but only if they were a truly independent regulator and not appointed by the government. But otherwise, as you can see, and with the rationale around it, pretty much an even split across between the two of government and overseen by Parliament.
So definitely still remaining within that representative system, within the political mechanisms of drawing those lines.
Unless there was a truly independent regulator.
Okay, thank you. Now, I guess what we've seen from this, and hopefully you found it interesting hearing back from some of the other groups, is that you have all been having some quite sort of different conversations and potentially, falling on different sides of the line when we start going, well, what actually would be the best system for a good democracy? We're going to be playing with these ideas tomorrow and starting to develop up these ideas of, well, what collectively can start thinking about a good system for regulation and scrutiny of and limiting the powers of government and Parliament. Again, tomorrow, no more speakers. You'll have Alan around to be able to sort of ask any questions and get any clarification, but it's really down to you to, start trying to make sense of it all. And I think at that point, that's us going to be finishing up. Alan, did you want to say anything just to finish up there? And then I've got a couple of practical things for you.
Lots of hard work and hard thinking there. So many, many thanks for doing all of that. And as Kayla says, we'll have lots of time in the morning to get our heads fully into all of that and come to further conclusions. So I'm really looking to hearing what you've all got to say tomorrow morning.
So just a reminder, we start at 10. You can join if you can. It helps out if you can join the call a little bit early. Then you can go off and get a cup of tea. It just means we can start getting breakup groups and everything sorted. So you will have seen the countdown going there like we had this morning. And just a reminder, I know some people had some unusual problems with Zoom today and problems they hadn't had before. Zoom, the app, has done an update. So if you get a little message when you log in or when you try to open it that says, there's an update, if you can, hit yes, do the update, and hopefully it'll make your Zoom work better for you tomorrow. Okay, so you'll get an email in the morning with the link for tomorrow's meeting, and I look forward to seeing you there. Enjoy your evenings.